Silent Hill is one of my favorite horror series. It may not be as prolific as other franchises, but with 3 certified hood classics on the PlayStation Double, and some other titles I haven't played, mostly because they're out of my price range,
Oh my god!
this series holds a special place in my heart. I think the later games in the series are much better, but the original is still worth looking at, if only to appreciate how it walked so Silent Hill 2 and 3 could run. So, without further ado, let's look back at the game that started it all, Silent Hill the First. So first, a quick rundown of the game. So in Silent Hill, you play as dutiful father and talented driver, Harry Mason, as he scours the lonely town of Silent Hill for his missing daughter, Cheryl. Nearly everyone in the town has vanished, with monsters stalking the streets. It's a race against time for Harry to find his daughter. So first, I wanted to talk about the game's mechanics. During your stay in Silent Hill, you'll be navigating its foggy streets, exploring indoor dungeon-like areas, slapping monsters around, solving puzzles, and taking everything that isn't nailed down. I find the navigation to be one of the more interesting parts of the game. Your view's heavily restricted by fog, so often you have to rely on your map to navigate, and that map's updated each time Harry gets new information. I really like how organic this feels. I think it's really realistic for someone in Harry's situation to mark up their map like this, though I wish the game would let you make your own marks as well for that little extra bit of immersion. So the navigation is made complicated by the inclusion of enemies in the overworld. The streets are wide enough that you can often dodge and run past enemies, so it often only makes sense to kill them if they're guarding somewhere you need to go or if you're having trouble evading them. So during combat, you can open the inventory menu to freely change weapons, reload, or heal. I feel like being able to pause the game to do this takes some of the tension out of the combat, but ultimately it's a minor issue. One thing I do really like about the menu, though, is how all your items have like their own little 3D models that spin around in the menu. The way it looks feels really iconic to the series to me. Regarding the weapons, I found that the long melee weapons and the pistol were more than enough to carry me through the game, and I could just save the larger guns for the boss fights. Combat rarely poses a challenge unless you're fighting a group, because isolated enemies can just be stun-locked using one of the long melee weapons. Even if there are multiple enemies, most of the challenge comes from managing Harry's awkward tank controls and trying not to get cornered. I think like the only time I died during my recording playthrough was when I got munched by the fucking lizard for not firing soon enough after its mouth opened. So occasionally, the game will spice things up with a boss fight. The bosses have very simple mechanics. I imagine this was done to accommodate how difficult it can be to control Harry. I think like the most complex it ever really got was like running circles around the worm boss as it comes out of the ground. Speaking of the funny little worm, most of the bosses in Silent Hill are animals, oddly enough. You got a lizard, a worm, a pig, and a moth. With the final boss being either the angelic incubator or the demonic incubus, depending on whether or not you saved Kaufman in an obscure side quest. So in my playthrough, I ended up finding the incubator and getting the bad ending, because I didn't really look at any guides while I was playing, so I didn't end up finding the side quest for the true ending. Honestly, I found that boss to be like really anticlimactic. Like, you're supposed to be fighting like a god, but like I had more trouble fighting the bug because I had so much ammo and healing saved up by the end. I could just like stand in one spot and shoot it with the rifle and shotgun until it fell over. And like it couldn't even hurt me because I could just heal every single time it hit me. So despite being so simplistic, I think the combat's redeemed somewhat by the radio mechanic. At the start of the game, you find this old radio that plays static whenever an enemy is nearby. The static nearly always starts playing like before you can see the enemy. They're either obscured by fog, darkness, or just off screen. I really like how this works with the game's combat. It makes every enemy encounter fair because it alerts you to the danger in advance, but it's still tense because it doesn't tell you like where the monster is. Another cool feature of it is how once all the enemies nearby are dead, the radio goes silent, so it provides like a momentary sense of safety until it starts up again. All in all, I found the game's combat to be pretty easy. That may just be because I played it before, but like that was over 5 years ago, so I'm not really sure how relevant that is. The game is just like so generous with supplies and enemies aren't really too difficult to defeat, so the tension of the combat is really carried by the sound design and the atmosphere, like with how the radio builds tension for each encounter, as I was saying earlier. Silent Hill isn't often really celebrated for its combat mechanics. It's best remembered for the sights and sounds that create its atmosphere. So one thing I love about Silent Hill is how it can take the familiar sights of suburban life and just twist them into like this unfamiliar, unsettling state. The streets and alleys you explore are abandoned, cars are left in the street, most of the buildings are locked up, and the only living things left on the streets are certainly not human. It seems as though like every person in the town just suddenly vanished without warning. To me, it evokes the fear of being somewhere you're not supposed to be, or like the unease of being somewhere that should be full of people, but left barren and robbed of its purpose. These sections of the game kind of remind me of like the liminal spaces that have gotten really popular recently, like familiar locations that should feel comfortable or mundane, but with the absence of people, something just feels very wrong about them. So I think the buildings you explore throughout the game really capture this sensation the best. As you explore Silent Hill, you'll find indoor areas to fight and puzzle your way through, the largest of which being the Midwich Elementary School and the El Camilla Hospital. These buildings are devoid of people, instead the halls are stocked by these nightmarish representations of the people who used to inhabit them. Exploring these locations felt like being somewhere that I'd often visit, but like at a time that I wasn't supposed to be there. Like being in a school or a shopping mall after hours once everyone else had left. So a key feature of the game's atmosphere is its use of sound. While each area has background sounds, most don't really have what you traditionally call music. Instead, they prefer to use like ambient sounds. For the first part of the school level, for example, with the school like almost totally empty, all you can hear is the stagnant air of the empty building. It's almost peaceful in a way. Other levels, though, have much more unsettling soundscapes, such as the sewer levels. In those ones, all you can hear is the dripping of water from the ceiling, accompanied by the sounds of these skittering insects and inhuman wails in unseen corners. So the game isn't singular in its aesthetic. Occasionally, the familiar yet unnerving town will fall away, revealing this horrific mirror image of foggy, silent streets giving way to an expanse of rust, blood, and harsh metallic screeches. Throughout the game, the town is slowly consumed by this darkness. In the game's early hours, the otherworld rarely appears, but it becomes more common as the game progresses, until by the end of the game, the town is consumed entirely by the otherworld. Aside from its hellish visuals, the Otherworld also greatly differs from the real world in the sounds that are associated with it. Where the real world often employs dull, unsettling, yet almost peaceful sounds, the soundscape of the Otherworld is much harsher. The music, if it can be considered such, uses sharp mechanical clashes and screeches to create this hellish cacophony. It was honestly painful to listen to sometimes, in a good way though. Now, the harsh sounds actually are a key part of the Otherworld's horror for me, as they make being there just so uncomfortable that I wanted to escape almost as much as Harry does. While the source of the Otherworld is initially a mystery, you discover over the course of the game that it's actually being manifested by a young girl named Alessa. Tormented by her classmates at Midwich and later being bedridden at the El Camilla Hospital due to her severe burns, she ends up creating a world far worse than the hellish one she had already endured. Knowing the Otherworld's created by Alessa's mind, some aspects of its design actually start to make some sense. Like the first time that Harry is brought into the Otherworld, he finds this abandoned wheelchair, which becomes a recurring element throughout the game. I think this is supposed to represent how Alessa's crippling injuries are a key part of her trauma, and therefore the wheelchair can be found in many places throughout her world. Just as a side note, I also really like how this game plays with the camera in the opening sequence. The odd camera angles and the wailing sirens in the distance make this part of the game really disturbing. It's a shame they don't really do much else with the camera in the rest of the game, aside from like one part where the camera's behind Harry's head as he runs. So one of the coolest things about the Silent Hill series is how much thought goes into the enemy designs. This is more of a thing in the later games, but some of the enemies in this game actually still have some interesting things going on with them. One obvious example is how the boss in the school is a representation of a lizard from a story you can find in one of the classrooms. I really like how the story actually hints at the boss's weakness, which is being shot when its mouth is open. I always enjoy when games leave these little details for you to find that help you later. So while the lizard boss is pretty clear in its meaning, other enemies leave some room for interpretation. Like the child enemies in the school and the nurses in the hospital, they could reflect how Alyssa saw the people in those locations, but they could also just be actual people that have been corrupted by her supernatural influence. I think this is almost certainly the case for the nurse enemies, because they appear normal save for the growths on their backs. I feel like these growths are some kind of parasite, since the nurse you meet in the hospital, Lisa Trevor, is normal at first, but seems to be slowly changing into one of the nurse enemies. Also, if you manage to save Sybil during her boss fight, it's revealed that some sort of parasitic creature was controlling her, so I think it's reasonable to assume that a similar sort of creature could be controlling the hospital staff as well. I didn't really find the other enemies to be compelling, though. They consist of these dogs, flying creatures, bugs, and various humanoids. Maybe there's some deep lore behind them, but honestly I couldn't figure it out while playing. To me, it kind of seems like they were just standard type video game monsters that developers put in to have some variety. They tend to fit thematically with the areas they're found in. Aside from the bat things, I don't really know what's up with those. But to me, it didn't really feel like much thought went into them beyond that. So, speaking of designs, I thought that the design work that went into the pre-rendered cutscenes was really impressive. Their quality is even more impressive considering they were all made by one man, Takayoshi Sato. While it's admirable that he managed to make the cutscenes by himself, I think it's really disgusting how he was made to perform such a difficult task without any help. From what I understand, he was given the choice to either work alone and receive all the credit, but end up working hellish hours, or work under supervision and only be credited as an assistant, while doing slightly less work. He ended up choosing the former option to do all the work by himself. His dedication really shows in the details and the little personal touches in the animation. All of it was done by hand without motion capture, so the small details, like the confused furrow of Harry's brow or how Lisa closes her eye as the blood flows over her face, are incredibly impressive, especially for the time that the CGI was made. I think my favorite cutscene in the game is the blooper reel that plays after the credits. It's such a cute little detail that most games wouldn't think to include. I'm actually surprised this was made, considering how much work it must have been for Sato to make something that's ultimately just for a laugh. Personally, I like to think that he needed a break from working on the dark, depressing CGI, so he made the blooper reels a bit of a tonal break for both himself and the players. So lastly, I wanted to briefly touch on the game's story. If you don't want to be spoiled on it, you can skip ahead to this time code, but honestly, I don't really think there's much to spoil with this game. While Silent Hill has incredible atmosphere and world design, its story kind of fell flat for me. The later games in the series do a much better job with their stories. In this one, it felt as though the story was only there to provide a framework for the game, and give direction on where to go next. It has some interesting details, though they're mostly confined to documents you can find laying around. Initially, the story focuses on Harry's search for his daughter, but later it shifts to focus on the story surrounding Alessa and how the attempts of her mother's cult to birth a god from her has resulted in the corruption of the town. So at the end of the game, you put a stop to Dahlia's plan to birth her god, and you can get one of 4 endings. The ending you get is based off whether or not you did 2 optional side quests relating to Sybil and Kaufman. So while this ending system adds replay value, I'm not really a fan of how it was executed. If you miss Kaufman's side quest, which is easy to do since it's out of the way of the main story path, you're locked out of the good endings. Personally, I'd prefer if the ending was based off some choice you made during the main story, or based off your playstyle like how Silent Hill 2 does it, rather than basing it off whether or not you completed some obscure side quest. So despite closing on a sour note, I still think the first Silent Hill is a great game in its own right, but I think it's kind of been overshadowed by the games that followed it. It does a lot of interesting things, and it deserves to be appreciated for starting such a great series, but it definitely shows its age. But regardless of its flaws, I think everyone who enjoys this series really owes it to themselves to play the first game any way they can. You can get it on PS3 for cheap like I did, or on the original PlayStation. Failing those options, you could also choose to be a criminal and emulate it if you really can't get your hands on a legal copy. So, that was my first video. If you made it this far, I'm assuming it was at least somewhat entertaining. I'm hoping to make this a full-time thing, so you can subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. I'm interested in covering more horror games, but I do really want to branch out to other genres once I'm done covering the first 4 Silent Hill games. So if you enjoyed the video, you can feel free to feed the algorithm some nutritious likes and comments. And lastly, if you want to support the channel further, and only if you can afford it, you can toss you some cash on Patreon, and take care.
Poor child, come to me.